All right, guys, so this is Key Concept 3.2. Key Concept 3.2 states continuity and innovation of state forms and their interactions. So this is focusing on, again, the political structures of these empires, right? So empires collapsed and were reconstituted in some regions. New state forms emerged. Following the collapse of empires, most reconstituted governments included the Byzantine Empire and the Chinese dynasties combined traditional sources of power and legitimacy with innovations better suited to their specific local context. So this is focusing on, those new empires and once again their political structures. So let's talk about the Byzantine Empire, right? This is going to emerge with the fall of the Roman Empire. It's the old Eastern Roman Empire that was founded by Constantine. 527 CE, it included the Mediterranean, North Africa, Spain, Italy, Southwest Asia, the Balkans, which today would be like Croatia or Serbia. Constantine legalized Christianity, so that was very important, right? He's going to establish the Eastern Orthodox Church, and this was used to legitimize imperial rule. So going forward, right, the Byzantine Empire would be a theocratic government. It was highly centralized with a tax system like Rome. Justinian's code did emerge, right? So there was a legal code. And again, it was a theocracy, meaning there was no separation of church and state. The emperor was head of the church, and he was also the governor, or he was the ruler. So maybe he didn't make the day-to-day decisions regarding the church, but he oversaw the church. He would choose the bishops, and he would kind of establish religious doctrine like iconoclasm, if you recall. That was a political policy that banned religious symbols and icons under Louis III. That would eventually get repealed, but a good example of, again, the ruler establishing religious doctrines. Right, Kievan Rus, that would be the emerging Russian Empire. Early on, it was more of a region of city-states. I guess kind of like, the Aztec empires, not centralized per se. So remember, Russia, early on, it's a combination of Viking nomads and Slavic peoples, right? And the city-states, again, are kind of independent from one another. Kievan Rus was the largest or the strongest of the city-states. Each city-state had a prince that was elected by a council of nobles, and it was a theocracy in a sense, right? Where Orthodox Christianity did drive the politics and culture. The Umayyad Empire, that would be one of the two Islamic empires that emerged during this time. 661 CE, it was founded by merchants from Mecca. Damascus was the capital. It was the largest of the empires, of the Islamic empires, and the largest empire since the old Roman Empire. Eventually, Islam does spread to Persia. That's under the Abbasid Empire. All of these empires, including the Abbasid Empire, were bureaucratic. There were viziers or prime ministers, the ruler to the people. The empire, obviously would collect taxes from those who did not convert, but it was a struggle, especially for the Abbasid Empire, to collect taxes because, these dominions or regions were far away from the central government. Under the Umayyad Empire, the city of Cordoba became an Islamic capital in 711. Just evidence of the spread of Islam, right, as far west as Spain. The Battle of Tours, you might see that. That was kind of a battle that was won by Europeans, the Franks, and that actually slowed Islamic expansion into Western Europe. So it, again, would be part of expansion, writing an essay about expansion, what motivated expansion, but just remember that it was slowed down by European kingdoms like the Franks. The Abbasid Empire, as I mentioned earlier, their influence did extend into Persia. The Caliph was Harun. If you recall, his wives were kind of problematic in a sense. Remember the harem politics. Baghdad was the new capital. It moved from Damascus. Abbasid rulers, were obviously, theocratic. They were religious leaders. They claimed a relationship with Muhammad through his uncle, so they were heads of the religious community as well. There was a court or a judge known as a ulama who implemented Islamic law. So that wasn't just for the Abbasid Empire, but it would add to the would add to an essay about politics or governing of an Islamic empire. They take over Persia. That's important. 651. It's there that you're going to see kind of the spread of Arabic into that region. And vice versa, you're going to see Persian spread into Arabia because of that transfer. Early on, non-Arabic and Arabic-speaking people were treated poorly, and that was kind of a contradiction because it went against the Muslim ideology of brotherhood. As time would go on, though, Persians eventually were able to convert, but keep their culture and language. But again, there was some tension between Arabic-speaking people and non-Arabic-speaking people in Persia. All right, so the Tang Dynasty, the Tang comes before the Song. 618 to 907, there was a lot of prosperity and stability. A fairly large empire from northern China or Manchuria down to Vietnam. The tributary system was in place. Remember the kowtow, where you might see an image of that, right? The idea of showing respect to that ruler. Tang Taizong is the ruler that we would remember, Tang Dynasty, and he built roads, canals, established a postal or messenger service through those taxes or tributes, which obviously reduces the danger from bandits. He expands the bureaucracy. He continues the Han Civil Service test, which obviously leads to an emphasis on education. But for the most part, aristocrats are probably going to get the better positions, but you're going to still have people in the lower classes get some opportunities. The Song Dynasty follows. Remember, that's the dynasty where you're going to see a lot of economic prosperity, right? This commercial revolution, the proto-industrial period. They're going to continue those bureaucratic governments that established meritocracy. Remember, meritocracy goes all the way back to the Qin Dynasty. They expand education to the lower classes. So if you're in the lower class, you're probably doing better in the Song Dynasty. The costs of governing, though, did weaken the economy over time. The scholarly gentry, remember, that's a new class that emerges, right? So on the top, you're going to have the rulership, but those scholars or those government officials are going to kind of seize more power. They're going to be involved more in military affairs, which was probably not a great thing because they lacked that experience. So that's going to leave the empire vulnerable to attack. Nomadic attacks were very common. That would continue. Remember that was occurring during the Han Dynasty. They do move the capital from Chang'an to Kaifeng and then later to Hangzhou. So you're going to see Hangzhou become the key, urban area. They would later be under Mongol control. So from the Song Dynasty, we go to the Mongol occupation. That dynasty would be known as the Yuan Dynasty, the Mongol Dynasty. All right, Japan. So Japan was a small island, highly influenced by China. That's very important. The spread of Buddhism will be a result of Chinese Buddhist missionaries. Japan was a highly feudal system, very decentralized, but under Shotoku Taishi, you're going to see a more centralized government. He is going to kind of mimic the Song and Tang dynasties. He's going to implement Chinese practices like meritocracy. He's going to hire Chinese workers. He's going to send nobility to study Chinese culture. He's going to establish woodblock printing and promote Neo-Confucianism. So that's a change in Japan. So during this time, during the Song and Tang dynasty, Japan is going to become more like China for a small time period, around 646. These are known as the Taika reforms. Not only what I just mentioned, they're also going to put farmland under control of the government and tax farmers. So there's a lot of government regulation here. It's a great example of centralized government. It will minimize, or they'll seek to minimize the powers of those feudal lords, and that was a problem. Remember, that was a problem in Europe, right, where the feudal lords often were more powerful than the monarch or the single kingdom ruler. So it was difficult to sometimes, develop or maintain that centralized government. And what follows is the Heian period. So there's this change again where we go backwards towards the later, towards the 700s or 800s, I believe. As we get closer to 1000 CE, Japan will return to a centralized government as the nobility regains power and rejects those Taika reforms. Obviously, you would if you're losing your land. The merit system maintained, but it was not open to all classes like it was during the Song Dynasty, right, in China at least. And that will strengthen the power, influence, and nobility. So going forward, you're going to see more of a return to decentralization. All right, Japanese feudalism, like European feudalism, lacked a centralized government. There might have been an emperor, but that emperor was not as powerful or as influential as the local lord. There was very little social mobility, probably more mobility in European feudalism. If you were a knight, you might receive more land. If you were a knight's assistant, you might become a knight. But in Japan, peasants were much poorer, I would probably argue. Samurais were protectors like knights. The daimyo would be the landowner or lord or noble. They had greater power, more influence than European nobility, and that's an important change. The shogun would be the emperor, okay? Or in England, it would be kind of the king. Or I'm sorry, in Europe, it would be the king. Like European feudalism, there was a code. The knight code might have been to be, code of chivalry. In Japan, it was a code of loyalty, or bushido, that stressed frugalness, loyalty, or honor until death. I don't think that knights in Europe had that same code of loyalty. European feudalism, as I mentioned, had more social mobility, and again, knights could obtain more land titles, and the knight assistants or squires could become knights. So you might want to compare and contrast feudalism in Japan, and be able to compare feudalism in Japan with feudalism in Europe. English. So talk a little bit about government in Europe. Remember, time would go on as we get closer to the 13 and 1400s. Europe becomes more centralized. The kings start to centralize or consolidate their power. But there are some important aspects of European, politics that you do want to remember during the 6, 7, or 800, CE period. And that would be basically checks on growing monarchies, especially in England. That's important. You're going to have the Magna Carta around 1215, and that's going to basically be like an early constitution. These laws were created to limit the power of the king. So as the king grows more powerful, William the Conqueror and his descendants, the noble class recognizes they need to check that power. The Magna Carta outlined a right to a jury trial. It established English Parliament, which is like our Congress, and the rights of the nobility were increased, but not the commoners. They didn't have much say. Parliament had two houses. The House of Lords would represent the nobles and the church leaders, and the House of Commons would maybe represent the wealthy merchants or the wealthy townspeople. But a peasant would not have a say. So it's a form of early democracy, or at least early checks and balances, but it really wasn't democratic like you would see going forward. So also, let's go back to comparing the Chinese with European government, the Franks, the Carolingian dynasty. Remember, both used religion to legitimize rule. I know, the Chinese dynasties weren't theocratic, but remember Empress Wu did try to establish Buddhism as a religion, or at least, ancestor veneration was very important. So, maybe I would even put that in the differences, but I think religion was at times important, just a different type of religion, right? Ancestor veneration versus, ancestor veneration and obviously, Christianity. So you want to differentiate that it wasn't really, a true organized religion. But Empress Wu did try to establish Buddhism as a religion. There was a high value on education. I think that's important. Right, the monasteries promoted a Catholic education, at least to the noble class. There were centralized governments, maybe not, the European governments weren't as centralized as China, but there were, there was a king with bureaucracy, right? And they both had to face invaders. So I would probably argue they were more different, but there were some similarities. Feudalism was more common. in Europe, where obviously in China it was highly centralized. So I think that's a big difference. China experienced much more prosperity, especially under the Song dynasty, right? Those civil service exams and meritocracy were unique to China and not Europe. There was the Grand Canal in China, the Silk Roads that promoted trade, the innovations, right? The infrastructure projects. Again, I'm going to probably go with Chinese government or Chinese dynasties were more different than European governments, but there were a few similarities. All right, feudal system in Europe, you want to be able to understand it. It is a system of obligation. It was constant between 800 and 1200 CE. Oaths of loyalty and codes of chivalry are common. The manorial, the manorial system, the manor. Remember the lord would own the land. He would rent the land, or he would allow peasants to farm the land. In return, they would give him crops, and they would get protection. Right? Again, a system of obligations. There was very little mobility. There was, I think that these lords did believe in Christianity. I think that the Pope had a lot of influence, but they were not theocratic. So the landowner was not the priest or the church ruler, right? In that community, there would be a church where the priest would have a lot of influence, but not necessarily, as influential as you would see in the Byzantine Empire. Decentralized governments, very important. Nobles had more influence and power than the king or lord. Japan, the nobles were more influential. All right, the Mongols, right? Genghis Khan, 1210. They come in and they pretty much take over the Eastern world, right? Almost Europe. The kingdom would be known as a Khanate, right? Though the grandsons or the leaders that would take over from Genghis Khan were Khans, or Khanates. They had an efficient military command structure, units or groups, kind of like the Romans. That was very important. A messenger service was established along the Silk Roads. We've seen that before, right? They incorporated conquered people into their army and adapted weapons and technology from the Chinese and the Persians. So they would not necessarily punish those captives. They would incorporate those who were conquered. Religious tolerance was obviously extended. So you're going to see a series of different religions throughout the empire. Obviously, Islam is going to be more prevalent in Persia, in the Middle East. You're going to see Buddhism in China. You're going to see, Orthodox Christianity in Russia. So there was no single religion. In fact, the Mongols were more, they practiced animism, right? Remember animism with the shamans? So true Mongol religion was not Christianity or Buddhism, it was animism. They established international law to unify their empire and control that empire, in addition to the messenger services. And a tributary system was very important, like those other regions. And they would have a regional governor, like we've seen, right, to control the conquered people. What are the three Khanates that you want to remember? There was the Ilkhanate in Persia. They conquered the Abbasid territory in 1258. They destroyed Baghdad. 200,000 residents are massacred. They do allow Persians to serve as ministers and officials, as long as they paid that tribute, right? Mongols did convert to Islam here. So it's interesting that the Mongols who lived in this region converted. Toleration was common, but the Mongol governors or the Mongol leaders didn't support didn't stop those massacres of Jews and Christians. In fact, they at times supported those. They had difficulty collecting taxes over time. The empire would weaken, and eventually it would be taken over by new Islamic empires called the Gunpowder empires, and we're going to get to those down the road. The Golden Horde Khanate, they took over Russia. They were led by Batu in 1236. He invades Russia and he forces city-states and princes to pay tribute. Remember, the Mongols had a very hands-off governing philosophy here. There was a lot of respect for Mongols due to toleration and trade, but as time would go on, those rulers of Moscow would start to kind of skim off the top and take some of that tribute and fund their own armies. Eventually, the Mongols would be pushed out by 1380. As a result of the conquest, the Russians kind of started to improve their own militaries. Those city-states became more centralized. And also, Russia became very isolated. They didn't have the same interactions with Europe that, say, other parts of the world did. So they kind of missed out on the European Renaissance. And that would be something that would hurt Russia down the road. They wouldn't be very westernized. It would take them a long time to change economically and politically. The Yuan dynasty would be the Mongol dynasty that was governed by the Kublai Khan, the grandson. They attacked the Song dynasty. Took them a while, but eventually they ruled this region. They maintained direct control of the empire, unlike the Golden Horde Khanate. They do end civil service exams, and they staff government positions mostly with Mongol officials. So we start to see a change there where, native Chinese have less influence politically. They do promote religious tolerance. They did gain a lot of loyalty from Buddhists and Taoists. But they were tolerant of Muslims and Christians in that region as well. They did maintain a lot of customs and Confucian traditions, so that was important. When the next dynasty, the Ming dynasty, would pop up, you're not going to see a lot of change culturally. They did bring a lot of prosperity to China by improving and maintaining those Silk Roads. And they also protected Chinese art and literature. So, there are some pros and cons there. So the next subconcept, some states synthesize local and foreign traditions. So some examples of that would be the Chinese, extending their culture and influence into Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Neo-Confucianism spreads, Chinese writing, Tang policies like the civil service exam. The city of Kumsong in Korea was modeled after Chang'an and the gridded streets. And we're going to see Buddhist monasteries in Japan. So be able to articulate how Chinese culture and politics influence those other Asian regions. Persian traditions influence the Islamic world, the idea of religious tolerance. Obviously, the Abbasid Empire was governed by, Persian officials. Governors, for example, administrative officials, or they borrowed the idea of the Persian satrap. I think you're going to see again Persians, unlike the Mongols, the Persians were allowed to participate in government, and again the caliphs are going to adopt some of those, political structures, right? Like, again, the tax collector. And Baghdad, which was the center of Persia, continued to be obviously, an important Arab city, right? Became the capital of the Abbasids. Islamic universities modeled themselves after Persian schools, and the Persian poet Rumi influenced the Sufi movement. Remember the Sufi movement? That's the mystical kind of, it's kind of it's an extension of, or it's a modification of Islam. I don't think that's the right word. But anyway, the Sufi movement. All right, subconcept is the Americans as in Afro or like in Afro-Eurasia, state systems expanded in scope and reach. Networks of city-states flourished in the Maya region, and at the end of the period, imperial systems were created by the Aztecs and Incas. So, definitely be able to, summarize the political structure or even the cultural or social structure of the Aztecs. It's modern-day Mexico. Remember, they're, not a centralized government, lots of city-states, but, depending on the city-state, that local government did contribute a lot to the infrastructure. If you go to, Tenochtitlan or, back then, you'd see pyramids and temples and homes. Effective agriculture. Remember the Chinapas or the farming islands. So, the ruler of Tenochtitlan, Montezuma, or those who came before him, were very effective rulers. At least for that city-state, which was, again, Tenochtitlan is the famous city-state. There was a tribute system from conquered people. There was that great speaker or ruler. Slaves were usually at the bottom of society, probably war captives. Human sacrifice and polytheism were the key components of their culture. And trade, they had extensive trade. They traded as far north as California, Central California, and the Caribbean Sea. All right, subconcept. Interregional contacts and conflicts between states and empires encourage significant technological and cultural transfers, including transfer between Tang China and the Abbasids, transfers across the Mongol empires, transfers during the Crusades, and transfers during Chinese maritime activity led by Ming Admiral Zheng He. So you want to be able to explain cultural and economic transfer. Very easy concept, right? Paper-making techniques between Tang China and the Islamic empires, the spread of Neo-Confucianism, the civil service exam, Buddhist monasteries popping up in Korea and in Japan from China. The Mongols protected and rebuilt those Silk Roads, so you're obviously that's helping this transfer, but we know that it did result in the Black Death too, which was a negative transfer. Mongol armies, as they entered into Eastern Europe, they would bring those military methods, and those methods eventually did spread to Western Europe. The cannon, the Chinese gunpowder, Muslim flamethrowers would eventually be adopted by European armies. Men in Europe would start to wear Mongol-style pants and jackets. The Crusades helped transfer the Black Plague, in addition to the cultural and scientific innovations of the Muslims. Luxury goods are going back and forth as well. And it's not just the Silk Roads. Don't forget the impact of the Indian Ocean network. Hinduism and Buddhism is also spreading. I think that's important to remember, into Southeast Asia. So remember, Southeast Asia would be India, Malaysia, the islands of Indonesia, parts of Vietnam and Cambodia. So that's Southeast Asia. So remember, it's not just Buddhism, it's not just Islam, but Hinduism. All three religions end up spreading into this region. So a couple terms you might want to remember or see. Purohita, these were priests who brought Hinduism and Buddhism into Southeast Asia from India. Again, they're coming into Malaysia or the islands off the coast of Indonesia, like Bali. It is a Sanskrit name. So that is evidence that priests, would study Sanskrit in India and then travel to these islands and then obviously bring these religions with them. Borobudur is a location. It's on the island of Java. Again, one of these islands off the coast, or in this, island region. 775 CE. It is just, we see that. It is the location of the largest Buddhist monument in the world. I'm not sure if that's it in the picture. It is part of I can't even pronounce this, Srihaya Kingdom, and it is a pilgrimage site. So this could be a primary source. If you see this source or this picture, again, it's evidence of the spread of Buddhism into Southeast Asia. And again, parts of Southeast Asia become pilgrimage sites like Mecca for Buddhists. The Angkor dynasty which is modern day Cambodia. The ruler is Jayavarman. What he's going to do is combine Hinduism and Buddhism in Cambodia. Angkor Wat, we mentioned Angkor Thom. Angkor Wat is another, religious site in Cambodia. And again, it's a great example of the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism into that region. Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom. Very similar, if you look at the picture, different places, but very similar architecture. All right, Key Concept 3.3 is the next lecture. Thanks a lot, and go back and review.